This podcast is brought to you by AJ Bell and Shares Magazine. Shares Magazine is published by AJ Bell Media, part of AJ Bell.
Hello and welcome to this week's AJ Bell Money and Markets podcast. I'm Danni Hewson, and who better to help me dig through the manifestos that we've had so far than AJ Bell Director of Public Policy, Tom Selby. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Danni. Yeah, very exciting time for the likes of me. We've had the full tomes from the Greens, the Lib Dems and the Conservatives, with the latter promising a new Help to Buy scheme and further cuts to national insurance. We're expecting to hear from Reform UK next week and, of course, Labour, which we get on Thursday this week. But we've got plenty of policy nuggets from Labour already, including abandoning plans to bring back the pensions lifetime allowance.
So we'll dig through some of those. We are recording on Wednesday morning, so we've not had a chance to really dig through certainly the Greens. So we'll take a look at that next week. We'll also assess what it all might mean for your finances, as well as market reaction to all of that, and the snap election called in France. Plus, Apple finally reveals its AI gambit, which initially fell a bit flat and also upset Elon Musk. Plus, Raspberry Pi smashes its London IPO.
Yeah, it's a packed agenda, and we've got Dan Coatsworth talking to Will Orr from the Gym Group about how the nation is spending more money on health and fitness and the role his company plays.
So stay tuned for that one. Normally, Tom, we would start with markets, but this is not a normal week. And you have had the fun job of poring over some of the election manifestos we've had so far. Let's start with the Conservative manifesto. What jumped out for you?
Yeah, it's not work when you love it like I do, Danni. Plenty of this stuff from the Conservative manifesto had already been trailed, but there's loads of personal finance reforms for us to tuck into. So the big headline announcement was around national insurance and specifically further plans to reduce the main rate of national insurance. So that's the rate that's applied to earnings, or if you're self-employed, profits between £12,570 and £50,270. So the proposal from the Conservatives is to reduce that main rate of national insurance from 8% to 6%. They want to do that by 2027. So if they were elected to government and if they followed through with those plans, then if you're looking at someone earning the average salary of £35,000, that's roughly the average salary, they would save just shy of £450 a year from that cut alone, or around £1,345 a year as a result of the halving of national insurance from 12% we've seen since the start of the year. However, it's always worth remembering that with income tax allowances frozen, the government has very much been giving with one hand and taking away with the other. Now, they don't just stop there on national insurance, because there's a specific pledge to the self-employed as well. So that's a group that Rishi Sunak very keen to target and encourage and reduce their taxes. So he's suggested that the Conservatives would abolish national insurance altogether for the self-employed by the end of the next Parliament. And he's also set out a slightly less specific ambition to abolish national insurance for everybody. So remove national insurance from the tax system so that on your earnings, the main tax would just be income tax. But as I say, that's an ambition that doesn't have a time limit placed upon it. Now, it's not just tax that the Conservatives are looking to focus on. They're also looking to help people buy a house. So Rishi Sunak has admitted in one of his interviews that it's become harder to become a homeowner under the Conservatives, quite an awkward admission. But his policies for first-time buyers are likely to do little to change that situation. So rather than announcing a brand new shiny policy, the Conservatives have opted to rinse and repeat their previous policy and just extend the schemes that are already out there. So they've said that they'll extend the current stamp duty holiday for first home buyers and make it permanent. So that would mean that first-time buyers will pay no stamp duty on purchases up to £425,000. Now, under the old policy, that would have expired in March next year. The Conservatives saying that that will be made permanent. The manifesto doesn't make exactly clear whether it will also extend the relief for those buying a property worth up to £625,000. They currently benefit from no stamp duty on the first £425,000 of their purchase. Now, at the same time, the Conservatives are saying they'll extend the Help to Buy scheme. So that's the scheme which offers loans of up to 20% for homeowners buying new build properties. Now, all they say here is that they'll bring in a new and improved, in inverted quotes, scheme, and it's decidedly sparse on details as to how it will be bigger and better than the scheme we've seen before. And the final nugget that I think people will be interested in, and then I'm hoping we'll get onto pensions, which, as you know, is my favourite topic, is around child benefit. So this has been a bit of a running sore for the Conservatives while in government. So they have a policy which reduces the amount of child benefit someone is entitled to gradually when they earn over £60,000. That starting point was increased from £50,000 at the last budget. Now, the Conservative manifesto is talking about a significant overhaul of that policy. So they want to go further by basing this taper, so the point at which your child benefit is reduced, on household income rather than the current model, which bases it on individual income. So rather than having that £60,000 point of earnings where the taper starts to kick in for an individual, it will be the combined income of the household where the child benefit will start to be removed, and that's set at £120,000. So essentially two lots of £60,000. So the Conservatives reckon that move would benefit about 700,000 households, and the average gain per household would be just shy of £1,500 a year. So plenty of giveaways in there, a few nuggets, a bit of extra national insurance off people's bills if the Conservatives get elected. But whether that will be enough to turn the tides in the polls, I think, remains to be seen.
And I know you want to get onto pensions, but I think it's been quite marked that a lot of these measures are sort of building upon things that they announced in the last budget. So, of course, the direction of travel was to mess with those child benefit thresholds, to cut national insurance. Pensions, they've been very dedicated to the triple lock. And now they're talking about triple lock plus. What's all that about?
Yeah, a slightly odd one, but the Conservatives obviously incredibly keen to make sure that older vote gets out and votes for the Conservatives rather than the Labour or indeed the Reform alternatives. So we've talked loads of times about the triple lock. So that's the guarantee that the state pension will rise by the highest of average earnings growth, inflation, or 2.5%. So that's a pledge that both the main parties, the Conservatives and Labour, have said they'll stick with. But the Conservatives have gone one step further by proposing this triple lock plus, or the quad lock, as some people have called it. I think that's the maximum number of locks we can have now. I think I'm going to call it the quad lock. So this is the Conservatives' answer to the challenge of the state pension increasing by that triple lock to the highest of average earnings growth, inflation, and 2.5% at the same time as the personal allowance is frozen. So if you look at the full new state pension today, it's currently worth just over £11,500. If it keeps on increasing and the personal allowance remains frozen for people over state pension age, then eventually that full new state pension will be subject to income tax. So to prevent this, the Conservatives have essentially proposed applying that triple lock that works on the state pension to the personal allowance of those over state pension age. But crucially, they're not saying that will apply to those under state pension age. So if you're not age 66 or over and you're still in work, then your personal allowance will still be frozen until 2028. Now, there was one other pensions nugget in there that I think it's worth mentioning. So the Conservatives announced what they call the pensions tax guarantee. Now, this might be setting up a bit of a trap for Labour when their manifesto comes out, but they've said that they'll maintain the 25% tax-free lump sum that people are entitled to from age 55, so no changes to that 25% tax-free lump sum. They've said that they won't apply national insurance to pensions income. So national insurance applies to earned income when in work, but not pensions income as it stands today. And they've committed to not doing that. They've said they won't introduce any new taxes on pensions. And they've said they'll maintain the current system of pensions tax relief. So an attempt, I think, there to give savers at least some stability and some certainty over exactly what the pensions tax system will look like, and potentially looking to create a little bit of clear blue water between themselves and Labour when Labour announced their manifesto.
You've got to wonder if they're setting aside additional cash for HMRC, because a lot of these measures, and I'm thinking child benefits, they're going to be incredibly complicated to work through. And the issue with this quadlock that you were just talking about is it makes the younger members of society, they're going to be incredibly annoyed that their tax thresholds are still frozen in order to pay for the older generation not to have frozen tax thresholds.
Yeah, it's a pretty naked grab for older people's votes. There's no obvious argument to be made beyond the fact that because of the triple up, the state pension is going to go over the personal allowance. There's no particular reason why the personal allowance of older people should be higher than the personal allowance of younger people. That was actually the case about 10 years ago. So there was a different personal allowance in place for those over state pension age versus those under state pension age. The decision by George Osborne when he was Chancellor to align those, I think, was a sensible move and frankly made this tax system fairer and a lot simpler. So the Conservatives are proposing something that takes us back a step from that and will eventually mean that those over state pension age will get one personal allowance and those under state pension age will get a different one. So more complexity and certainly an argument that it's increasing intergenerational unfairness, which has been a hot topic for a while.
That's what you love, though, isn't it? Complexity in all things pension related. Look, we've not had the full Labour manifesto yet, but we have had a number of policies announced ahead of the big reveal, which happens tomorrow, Thursday, as we're recording this on Wednesday morning. And a big one from your perspective must have been that they've abandoned plans to bring back the lifetime allowance.
Yes, I think this is really good news. So the backstory to this, the Conservatives in government announced that the lifetime allowance would be abolished altogether. That reform came into play in April this year. Now, when Jeremy Hunt was making that announcement at his budget, Rachel Reeves, in her response, again looking to create a dividing line, I think politically with the Conservatives, described this as a tax giveaway to the rich and suggested that Labour would reintroduce the lifetime allowance. Now, there's been a long period of silence since. I think it's fair to say that the act of reintroducing the lifetime allowance potentially more complicated than Labour had first thought it would be when they made that announcement. You've also got big issues for public sector workers in the NHS, who, when they bump up against the lifetime allowance with their generous defined benefit schemes, would face a potential tax charge as a result for working extra hours. So that's not really a great thing when you look at the strains facing various areas of the public sector, including the health service. And more broadly, for people investing in pensions, using pensions such as self-invested personal pensions or investing in the workplace, the lifetime allowance it puts a barrier to people's ambition. So it reduces it essentially taxes people for enjoying strong investment growth. And it also would have added all sorts of extra complexity to a pension tax system that frankly is mind-numbingly complex already. Most people struggle to get to grips with it. So the fact that Labour's seen sense and has taken a pragmatic approach and has decided not to go ahead with that reintroduction of the lifetime allowance, I think is a good thing, and at least means we'll keep a semblance of simplicity, if you can call it that, within the pension tax system.
And they've also ruled out an increase in cap gains tax.
So yes, Labour said it has no plans to raise capital gains tax. So I think that's potentially a deliberate formation of words. So they're not completely ruling out having a plan to raise capital gains tax, but the line at the moment is no plans to raise it at this time. So a reminder that you pay capital gains tax at 20% on investments and 28% on property, where that gain is over the annual allowance of £3,000. £5,000. Now, Labour has gone out of its way to rule out quite a lot of tax rises, and I think that inevitably leads to suspicion about where exactly the tax rises might have to fall if it wins, because if you listen to the likes of Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies and others, then the public finances are in a pretty dire position and tax rises are all but inevitable, whoever wins the general election on the 4th of July.
And certainly, we're going to touch briefly on the Liberal Democrats now as well. And as I say, we will look at Greens and Labour more closely once their manifesto is out, and also Reform on the podcast next week. But the Lib Dems have said that they would raise £5 billion by reforming capital gains tax.
Yes, that's right. So the Liberal Democrats, unlikely to win the general election, but what they say could still be important. So it's not beyond the realms of possibility that they could form a coalition, perhaps with Labour, or they may still have influence from the opposition benches. So what they're talking about is increasing the capital gains tax allowance, first of all, so from £3,000 potentially to £5,000. But alongside that, they're making noises about simplifying the system and specifically aligning the capital gains tax rates with income tax rates. So that would mean that whereas at the moment everybody pays capital gains tax at 20%, as I said, 28% on properties, if you move to align that with income tax rates, then if you're a basic rate taxpayer, you'd be paying 20% on your capital gains. If you're a higher rate taxpayer, you'd be paying 40%, so double. And if you're an additional rate taxpayer, then it would be 45%. So that kind of reform, if it were brought forward, and as I say, the Lib Dems are likely to be an opposition party rather than a party in government, but if a government chose to bring forward a reform like that, then for lots of investors in particular, that would mean their tax bill on their gains would potentially go up.
So I've been taking a look at how markets have been reacting to this drip of manifesto launches, and it's been quite hard to separate out the impact of the different manifestos from the political turmoil that has been going on in Europe after EU elections, and then the unexpected snap election called by President Emmanuel Macron in France. We saw the FTSE 100 and a lot of European markets really on the back foot at the start of the week, performing better Wednesday after the latest GDP figures, which I'll talk about in a minute. But one of the things that we have seen is sterling continue to make solid gains against the euro since the start of this week, now trading at a 22-month high against the eurozone currency. And, you were talking a lot there about house builders and some of the measures, particularly the Conservative Party, have announced as part of their manifesto. I dare say there'll be an awful lot in Labour's manifesto about housing as well, and that is likely to have another knock-on to housing stocks, because we did see shares in house builders, including Persimmon, Taylor Wimpey, also DIY groups like Wix and the B&Q owner Kingfisher, and estate agents, including Foxtons, all seeing their shares move higher on the news. So anything that Labour says around housing is likely once again to move the dial on those stocks when that election manifesto is released later this week.
Yeah, a good reminder there that there is a world outside of the political debate and the general election in general. And whilst elections clearly have taken centre stage in lots of ways, that doesn't mean markets are any less focused on interest rates, does it, Danni?
No, I mean, that has been where investors have really been laser focused, kind of almost having blindfolds on to try and, make them think about something else has been pretty tricky. We are recording this, as we say, Wednesday. I keep reminding you, and that is because there's an awful lot of economic data, plus the pesky little issue of a Federal Reserve rate decision coming later today. Now, looking at US inflation, economists are expecting it to remain static at where it was. If it comes in hotter, that is likely to move markets. And of course, we're not expecting the Federal Reserve to make any changes to its interest rates this time out. There has been a huge amount of focus as well on what the Bank of England might do next Thursday off the back of some economic data that we've had through this week. So one of the things we had was jobs data, and that showed that unemployment had ticked up slightly, surprisingly, which did catch quite a lot of people on the hop. Economic inactivity, again, massively high. And a lot of that is down to sickness. So, of course, all this focus on the NHS and elections it is clearly going to be one of the things which people on the doorstep are going to be talking about. But wage growth still stubbornly high, remaining at 6%. Now, it was expected because, of course, we did have that increase in the national living wage in April, and that has very much filtered into this latest set of jobs figures. But you add that to the fact that we got GDP figures out this morning for the UK, and whilst the UK was really on the front foot, sort of powering out of recession at the start of the year, April, well, it was damp, it was cold, it meant that the construction sector just really continued to fall back. You know, as a roofer, who wants to be up on a roof when it's absolutely chucking it down? And also, people weren't out on the high street. I mean, did you go out on the high street in April and buy anything, or were you holed up in the office or at home?
I very rarely go out on the high street and buy anything. I've got to say, I have a shopping trip about once every 2 years where I just get everything done and then I avoid it. So I'm not sure I'm the best person to test high street sentiment.
One thing that was notable, though, is we've got the FTSE 100 and the FTSE 250, Freudian slip there, both great guns off the back of the GDP figures, which you might say, well, they weren't great. You know, we got stuck again, but we got stuck. We didn't fall back. And I think a lot of people are assuming that April's GDP figures are something of a blip. Remember that we've got the Euros kicking off this week. A lot of pints expected to be sold in that. TV sales apparently up, according to the British Retail Consortium. And also, if you're not a football fan, you're not heading out to the pub, well, you might be heading out to watch a concert. And Taylor Swift's Eras Tour in particular is expected to generate a huge amount of cash. But just in terms of rate cut expectation, I've been watching these figures like a hawk over the last couple of days. And markets have come to the conclusion that it's just as unlikely that the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee will cut rates in June after all of this data as they thought last week. So still 10%, few more, about 40% thinking maybe August, but most now thinking that September is the better bet.
Yeah, a good reminder there, Danni, of some of the fundamental economic challenges facing the UK, and also a good reminder that the football starts on Friday and we can all start focusing on that rather than the Green Party and Liberal Democrats manifestos. Now, one thing that was absent from the Conservative Party document was plans for a British ISA. So this was the idea that an extra £5,000 of ISA allowance would be created and that investors would have to use their money to invest in UK stocks and potentially UK funds. So that was something that was proposed, it was consulted on, and then has seemingly quietly been dropped. But the London stock market has had a boost elsewhere this week, hasn't it, Danni?
It has. I mean, we've been talking about a dearth of IPOs on the London stock market really for over a year now. And the story has been that either big tech companies like Arm are choosing to list in New York, or some of the companies on the London Stock Exchange at the moment are choosing to move their primary listing across the Atlantic in order to make the most of higher valuations. So I think it's fair to say there was an awful lot of excitement and a few nerves about the IPO of Raspberry Pi. Now, this is a low-cost computer producer. A lot of schools use these things. My kids had Raspberry Pi to learn how to code when they were at primary school, and really smart stuff. I mean, this is a business which is already profitable. It believes it can sustain its strong growth trajectory. And I think a lot of investors, when looking at this, seeing that this is a jam today company, not a jam tomorrow company, it's making jam right now, they really got on board with this IPO. So we had that wonderful IPO first day pop, and shares were up 40% higher than where they initially landed at. Now, retail investors can get in on the action on Friday, but this is a business really that I think demonstrates that there is money out there for the right companies, and that tech companies can float in the UK if they have the right offer. And this company had already attracted investors like Arm, like Sony. So clearly, with that sort of backing behind it, a lot of investors were thinking, right, well, maybe it is worth taking a look at this. And potentially that does bode well for the London Stock Exchange. And there is still an awful lot of excitement, coupled with quite a bit of trepidation, about Shein's potential London listing. But just as I was getting excited about the trajectory for London, we got news today that one hoped for IPO isn't going to happen. Now, this is the Special Opportunities Real Estate Investment Trust. It had been looking to raise £500 million, but it failed to secure the minimum £250 million required to go ahead with the listing. The idea was it was going to buy cut price office properties and then take advantage of the shifting of the real estate market as businesses get used to their mix of hybrid working. But as I say, unfortunately, that has not happened. And of course, it's sort of started the jungle drums again on whether or not London markets really can recreate themselves and make themselves relevant for the future.
Fantastic, really interesting, Danny. I'm still reeling from the fact that your kids in primary school are using Raspberry Pi. I think when I was in primary school, I was playing in the mud and in the sandpit, and that was about it. So things have unsurprisingly moved on in the past 30 plus years since I was at primary school. But while we're talking tech, we have to mention Apple now, don't we? Because they've finally let the cat out of the bag on their AI plans, haven't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think people's expectation had really reached fever pitch, and Tim Cook had been under a lot of pressure because Apple shares, people were saying, why aren't you talking about AI? This is the golden ticket for a lot of companies. Just look at Nvidia's trajectory. And Apple hadn't. They kept saying, look, we'll unveil it when we're good and ready. And usually what happens with Apple is when they make these big announcements, it moves the stock market. So I think a lot of people were really surprised when the announce of Apple Intelligence was met with a bit of a meh, and shares actually closed down 2%. But I think when investors got a chance to really look at what this would mean, so the idea is AI on your handset would upgrade Siri. So for example, if I was saying call Tom, and I'd just been, writing something about pensions, it would automatically know that I wanted to call you and not another Tom who maybe, cuts the dog's fur or something like that. So it's smart stuff. And in addition, it was saying that where Siri could no longer help, then it would integrate OpenAI as well. And the bit that's really turned investor sentiment around, because we've seen a huge 7.3% increase in Apple shares on the day after this announcement was made, is that although these upgrades will be rolled out on iOS, so their operating system, if you don't have a new device that can cope with the huge amount of processing power, then you won't be able to upgrade to this new iOS. You won't be able to have all these new services. So it's a really smart way of, in the same way that 5G integration made us all jump to another iPhone, it's a great way potentially to get people who had maybe updated their phone in COVID, and then with the cost of living crisis, that was the one thing that they decided they weren't going to do anymore because they were saying, you know what, my phone is good enough. That a lot of investors now think that just maybe it will prompt a bit of an explosion in iPhone sales when they launch the new handset later in the year.
Interesting. And I just to say, I am open to dog fur trimming as well as pensions inquiries as well, Danny, if you're interested, for the right price, of course. Now, that link up with OpenAI, shock of all shocks, has annoyed a certain Elon Musk, hasn't it?
It has. And I don't think we can get through a Money and Markets podcast without talking about Elon Musk. Um, it was interesting because a lot of people won't know that actually he was involved in founding OpenAI. He co-founded it with the current CEO, Sam Altman, but left the board in 2018. And he had filed a lawsuit against the Chat GPT maker, accusing it of violating its non-profit mission. However, today it's been announced that he has withdrawn that case. But what he has said is that if OpenAI is integrated in Apple phones at the OS level, then he will look to ban Apple devices in his companies. So, if you have one of these things, you turn up at work, you're going to have to stick it in a Faraday box or something like that while you're there, because he is deeply concerned about privacy protection. Now, Apple have assured all iPhone users that privacy protections are built in for users who access ChatGPT. But clearly, this is something which is going to bear watching. And when you consider how many businesses Elon Musk has got his fingers in at the moment, that's probably quite a lot of employees that, potentially have to lock their phones away.
Want to keep an eye on, and one for the staff of those companies to keep an eye on as well. So, right, let's move on, because Dan Coatsworth has our guest interview this week. So here it is.
So given that so many people are into fitness and a healthy lifestyle these days, things like gym memberships, sports equipment, athleisure, these are all places where people are actively spending money. So to learn more about this area, I'm delighted to welcome Will Orr onto the podcast. Now, Will is chief executive of the Gym Group, one of the country's big gym chains, also one of the few leisure companies whose shares trade on the UK stock market. So Will, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for inviting me.
Pleasure. So I think, should we start off with just give some context to the Gym Group? I think in terms of perhaps how you fit into sort of the broader gym industry in the UK, how much do customers actually spend on average to use your gyms?
So yeah, the average headline price for our monthly standard membership is about £23. But we have membership from as little as £13.99 for our off-peak product. And I guess in terms of where that sort of fits into the wider picture of gyms, Dan, and the Gym Group, we were founded in 2008 along sort of similar founding principles to, say, EasyJet. So this is about saying, let's be really focused on the things that particularly matter to customers and strip out the things that matter less to customers in order to achieve a much more affordable price point. So in our case, that was about, and remains about, convenient location, 24/7 access, fantastic equipment, friendly staff, and no contract flexibility, and so putting all that together at an affordable price. So the Gym Group is in the, in quotes, high value, low cost sector of the gym market, which is actually where the growth is, because like a lot of other sectors, I think consumers kind of like that kind of no frills approach. So that's where we fit in. You could be exercising with us for, as I say, around sort of £23 a month, but as little as £14 a month.
Do you have any sort of figures that show how much people spend overall on sort of these sort of fitness activities and products in a year? I presume that they've been going up at a steady rate.
We'll say the industry and some analysis that we've done as well estimates that there are over 10 million gym members in the UK. 10.3 million of us are members of gyms, spending over £5 billion on gyms, and that's about 15% of the UK population. So gyms are, and fitness clearly is very much here to stay. And it's a very big, robust, growing market. So yeah, people are spending a great deal on it. But as I say, we're very much at the sort of affordable end of the spectrum within that market.
So obviously, if the fitness industry is buzzing, it's quite curious to see that actually Gym Group hasn't made profit for quite a number of years. Is that is that because you're not actually charging enough, perhaps, or is it as another reason why that's happened?
Yeah, we do make a cash profit before accounting for our lease liabilities, which to your listeners could sound somewhat jargony, but we do make a cash profit. And in fact, last year we made 27 million of free cash flow. So we are a cash generative business, and the important thing about that, Dan, is it enables us to continue to invest in more gyms. So we've got 236 at the moment. We intend to open another 50 over the next 3 years, and we're doing that all from free cash flow. So the business is in robust health financially, and as I say, we've got a sort of a continued path of sustained growth in a growing market.
So as I presume, if you're trying to improve the company's earnings, is it a case of keep opening new sites across the country, or is it actually looking at the pricing model, perhaps charging people more for sort of peak times, or replace equipment less often so you've got less money going out of the business?
Yeah, I mean, if I could perhaps answer it by talking about the sort of three key areas of our growth strategy. The first one, which we call strengthen the core, it is really all about increasing the cash returns from our existing estate of the 236 gyms. So that's about things like the best possible marketing to attract more customers to come to us. And very often that's about marketing very close to the particular site, because we know people tend to choose a gym based on location and convenience. So the best possible marketing, and then Dan, a big drive now to try and encourage our members to stay with us for longer. And that's really about helping members to establish a fitness habit and to meet the goals that they are trying to meet. And if we succeed in doing that, that's clearly a win for the customer. They get fitter, feel better, and it's a win for us because they stay longer. So it's principally, in simple terms, about how we attract more customers and get them to stay for longer. And then if we succeed in doing that, as I say, that creates more cash, and that enables us to do the second part of the strategy, which is to open more high quality sites, which we expect to continue to do over the next few years from free cash flow. And then the third element that we sort of call broaden our growth is that we may at some point see if there's some new opportunities, new areas for us to look at, to take our sort of skills and our proposition into. But fundamentally, it's about trying to attract more members into our gyms, keep them for longer, and then use that cash to open more gyms. And to your piece about the equipment itself, that's an enormously important part of our proposition. Is high quality, clean, well maintained, modern equipment, and so that's absolutely not something that we'll sort of cut corners on. We'll make sure that equipment, as I say, is maintained, is replaced when it needs to be replaced, and that is an absolute sort of founding principle of the business.
So I presume the bigger you get, you must be able to have economies of scale, be able to have buy equipment at a cheaper price, or do you think that you need to be considerably bigger for that to happen?
No, I think at the scale that we're currently at, I think you would definitely get some scale economies when it comes to things like gym equipment, and those scale economies will improve as we grow, but we certainly get those already. I mean, we're already a kind of at national scale and probably one of two big players in the high value, low cost part of the sector.
So what about sort of costs in general for the business? Obviously, we hear a lot about staff wages. They've been going up across multiple industries. Obviously, you've got to have the lights on your gyms. You've got to heat them if it's in cold times. What's generally happening with your business at the moment?
Yeah, so as a sort of low cost provider, I'm trying to make fitness affordable to as many people as possible. Clearly, keeping very tight on our own costs is enormously important. Again, I would say sort of a founding principle of the business. In terms of some of those specific things. I think when it comes to energy, we certainly work very hard to be as efficient as possible in terms of the energy that we use, and there's a whole range of measures that we've introduced to try and reduce energy consumption. When it comes to the price of energy, like a lot of other businesses, we saw some considerable inflation last year, but actually now we're quite well hedged in terms of our energy, and actually this year it's a much more stable environment for some of those kind of inflationary pressures. There is still some inflation, but as I say, it's much more stable than last year, perhaps off the back of Ukraine and so on. So as I say, we try and keep our costs under control, and we're now in a pretty stable environment when it comes to operating costs.
Is it possible to sort of define how the gym group is differentiated from the competition? Because I presume you all do something very similar. Is it just down to pricing point? Is how you're different from competition?
Well, I think if you sort of take the market as a whole, we are differentiated around this piece, around a position of kind of, in quotes, high value, low cost. So roughly speaking, you could perhaps split the market into three parts to say there are kind of high end, more sort of boutique style gyms at a very high cost. Then there'll be some in the mid market. And then we're at the more affordable end of the market, but with an extremely high quality product. And I think if you think about those sort of market dynamics and perhaps compare them, for example, to hotels, I think you can make a good business at the high end. You can certainly make a good business at the affordable end, so Premier Inn, for example. I think the tricky place is in the middle of those two things, because actually we can provide essentially as good a product and as good a proposition as the mid-market at a much more affordable price. So that's how we would sort of differentiate in terms of that overall gym market. And as I say, it's the low cost part of the market where all the growth is and where all the market share is coming from. So that's where we're positioned. And actually, PwC recently did a report that says the low cost part of the market, we could expect to see at least another 10 years worth of growth in rollout of low cost gyms around the country. So that's the part of the market that we're differentiated in. And then I think the other thing I would say is, don't ask me, ask our customers. And the differentiation is that, over 90% of our members rate us either 4 out of 5 or 5 out of 5.
So that's Dan Coatsworth talking to Will Orr from the Gym Group. And that is all we've got time for this week. Next week, we'll dig more fully into Labour's manifesto, take a look at what Reform UK and the Greens are proposing. We'll also hear from Neil Shah from the Edison Group about the best way to fix UK markets.
Until then, thanks for listening, and do leave a review wherever you download your pods.
Before you go, please remember this podcast is for educational purposes, and the views expressed don't necessarily reflect those of AJ Bell or Shares Magazine. The podcast isn't telling you if a certain investment is suitable or not. Don't forget that the value of investments can change, and you can lose money as well as make it. It's also important to remember that how you're taxed will depend on your individual circumstances, and rules can change. The way an investment performed in the past may not be the same as how it behaves in the future. If you want help, go see a qualified financial advisor.